Hi, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi. I'm a fellow at the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation. And this week in my Print on China column, I analyze the Chinese discourse on Chinese President Xi Jinping's ongoing visit to Southeast Asia. So he has visited Vietnam, now he's in Malaysia, and he'll conclude his visit with Cambodia. So the visit spanned from April 14th, till April 18th. So, of course, this is just not another trip on his diplomatic calendar. This is very significant primarily because this is his first overseas visit in 2025. And the reason he has chosen Southeast Asia to visit for his first foreign destination in 2025 is telling of how important the region has been for China. And for China, it is a reaffirmation of regional ties, as well as it's a strategic move to consolidate influence in its immediate neighborhood. So this idea that the peripheral countries are important for China is very much there in the strategic thinking of the Chinese leadership. But then if we look at the Chinese media coverage of his visit, it is centered around key themes. And it's not very surprising when we look into the Chinese discourse. It is, of course, about friendship, sincerity, kindness, and of course, the inclusiveness. So these aren't just buzzwords, but also a part of a broader narrative that portrays that China is a stable long term partner and a regional anchor in Southeast Asia. And this also makes sense from the Chinese perspective, specifically when the US is becoming less of a reliable partner, specifically security and economic partner in the Southeast Asian region. So then, with countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia, China is highlighting natural proximity, economic complementarity, as well as shared stability. So now, coming to Chinese discourse, it asserts that geographical closeness and entrenched economic ties make China a legitimate regional leader, and more so than extra regional powers like the United States. And in fact, one post on Weibo sums up the sentiment. The post was read as Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand may have strong ties with the United States. But if the US forced these countries to choose between the US and China, they would absolutely stand with China. There is this belief that these countries are absolutely going to be aligned with China in case they have to choose, is very much there. It's inherent in Chinese discourse. This actually reflects a core assumption in Chinese discourse that China is positioned to lead its neighborhood. And no power other than China has the ability, has the resilience to do that. But I think it's very important to note that his visit is just not about responding to shifting US priorities or responding to Donald Trump tariff under and I don't think that this is about the pressure, or this is about just about taking uh, the advantage of what's happening and how the US is treating the countries in the region. I believe that Xi's visit is part of China's long term strategy to reinforce its leadership in its periphery, an enduring natural role for China. And this is rampant on Chinese social media, Chinese strategic community. Scholars have been talking about and have been linking Chinese peripheral diplomacy with Xi Jinping's visit to Southeast Asia. And in fact, I don't think there is any coincidence that the Central Peripheral Conference was just concluded a week ago, and now he's on a visit to a region that is close to China, and that has been important strategically, economically, as well as in terms of security. And in fact, for decades, a key pillar of Chinese foreign policy has been peripheral diplomacy, which in Mandarin is called as Chopian Waichao. And Southeast Asia isn't just geopolitically vital for China, it is also a region where China's governance model is tested and showcased. And it is one of the regions where China's diplomacy has been tested, has been proven successful. And despite the differences, the South China Sea dispute is very much active. There are countries that are still fighting the Chinese aggression, assertion in the South China Sea. But the role of China, the formidable role of China in the region has been tested, has been proven. And in fact, a prominent Chinese scholar, Chen Kangrong, he puts it simply that, and in fact, he quotes an old Chinese proverb that distant relatives are not as close as neighbors. So the idea that China has to pay more attention to neighbors than distant relatives is very much the basis of China's relationship with Southeast Asia. And closer ties with Southeast Asia does provide China with both leverage as well as insulation, specifically amid the growing China US rivalry. As in, of course, even before this trade and tech rivalry, China's equation with Southeast Asia was something that was very prominent within Chinese foreign policy psyche, specifically since the 1990s, since China became the dialogue partner of ASEAN and how Chinese economic relations have become prominent. But I think specifically within this past 4 or 5 years, this relationship has assumed greater significance, greater role in Chinese foreign policy thinking. And according to Chin Kang Rong, the reasoning for choosing these three countries are is very much aligned with Chinese foreign policy priorities. And each stop on Xi's trip serves a strategic purpose. For example, Vietnam shares political as well as economic similarities with China. And of course, the party to party links is something that has been proven beneficial for China. Then Cambodia is a loyal partner with joint ventures like Ream Naval Base. And when it comes to Malaysia, uh, even though it's a bigger economy in the region, it has been somewhat aligned with China. It has been a friendly nation towards China. And in 2025, Malaysia is the ASEAN chair. And in this context, it does play a key role in regional integration that aligns with Chinese broader priorities. And apart from that, this trip is also important in terms of economic messaging. And if we look at the Chinese discourse, economic messaging is also very central to this narrative that is coming out of China. That China's trade relationship with ASEAN is increasingly vital. There is complementarity, with both sides being each other's largest trading partners. And Chinese media has been highlighting this complementarity as the bedrock of the future cooperation, as something that is driving the relationship. And in fact, Southeast Asia, specifically Vietnam, is deeply integrated into China's supply chains. And with this US tariff war going on, the region's reliance on China is going to become more and more pronounced. And there is no way that China is going to be omitted from this equation. So the idea that the tariff are only going to push Southeast Asian countries, specifically Vietnam, into Chinese economic orbit is something that has also been discussed. And then scholars like Yunling, who's also a prominent scholar, he highlights that while global consensus is elusive, and it's important that China also focuses on multilateral equation, multilateral institution, but regionalism is something that remains a viable path for cooperation. And this is where China's relationship with ASEAN is very important. And ASEAN in Chinese discourse is praised for its flexibility, for its uh, relevance, and for its significance, and highlighting the ASEAN centrality, which aligns with Beijing's vision for multipolar engagement and for trying to shape regional as well as global order in its favor. So, ASEAN in Chinese discourse is an organization that actually helps and benefits Chinese strategic and economic priorities. But this is, of course, all about Chinese discourse. But as always, reality is very different from what we have been seeing in the Chinese discourse on the Chinese online platform, as well as the scholars have been saying. And beneath the surface of this rosy portrayal of this friendship between China and Southeast Asian countries, there are areas of tensions that have been left unaddressed. And I do believe that when I look at the discourse, specifically when it comes to bilateral relationship, it's more censored, it's more sensitized version of what how things are. One example is, of course, the South China Sea dispute. And throughout my research, while I was doing research for this piece, I didn't find any piece that talked about the South China Sea dispute with regard to the visit of Xi Jinping. And Vietnam has been a party to the conflict. So I believe that when you don't talk about the conflict, you are actually not really paying attention to all the aspects of the relationship. And but this has been Chinese policy when it comes to countries that have territorial disputes with China, be it India, be it Vietnam. But of course, Philippines is a totally different country altogether. But I think Vietnam is one claimant in the region that China thinks that it could influence. And this is one of the reasons why there has been discussion about party to party cooperation, why there has been discussion about this friendship and brotherhood between Vietnam, the party of Vietnam, as well as the Chinese Communist Party, the economic complementarity, and the Chinese position in Vietnam foreign policy, but there is no mention of the South China Sea dispute. So, this notably absent narrative surrounding Xi visit tells us that everything is not really all right when we dig into Chinese discourse on Xi's visit to Southeast Asia. And in my opinion, by avoiding sensitive topics and uh, visiting countries more amenable and more friendly towards China in the region, Xi's trip helps project an image of Southeast Asia, of the region, that is leaning more towards China than the US. And this has been the objective of the projection of the narrative when it comes to China Southeast Asia relations, as well as specifically when the US has been kind of absent, when we don't really have a complete or any understanding of how Donald Trump's Indo-Pacific policy is going to be, how he's going to be invested in Southeast Asia. So, but in my understanding, this narrative, even though it's carefully managed, masks underlying regional divisions. And in reality, and this is something that scholars of foreign policy, scholars of ASEAN, China have been talking about, that ASEAN remains divided on how to engage with China and how to deal with the South China Sea. While, of course, the economic ties with Beijing are deepening, there is no doubt China has become much more of an important economic partner than ever before. Countries have talked about decoupling or de risking, but the economic dependence on China has really not been reduced. So, but despite that, Southeast Asian nations are also simultaneously strengthening relationship with countries such as India, Japan, and Australia, and the hedging diplomacy of ASEAN and the Southeast Asian countries, something that has already been established and in most of the cases has been proven successful as well. So I do believe that there is this gap in understanding what the Chinese discourse is trying to project and what exactly is the reality, what on the ground of how the China Southeast Asia relations are panning out. So, in my opinion, far from rallying behind Chinese leadership, Southeast Asia, ASEAN, individual countries are absolutely cautious. Of course, if you talk about Cambodia, Laos, it's a totally different thing altogether. But if we talk about Southeast Asia as a region altogether, I do believe and I do see that that has been acting cautious. It's absolutely fragmented when it comes to China, and it's increasingly hedging its bet. Sorry. And as China seeks to consolidate influence in its neighborhood, primarily Southeast Asia, the challenge will be whether the selective engagement, this selective projection of narrative and strategic avoidance of contentious issues can maintain long term stability, or if it will only intensify regional fragmentation. So I don't think that the projection of this hanky dory relationship between China and Southeast Asia is something that is the reality. I do believe that if China doesn't really address the South China Sea issue, it will only lead to regional instability. It will only lead to further fragmentation of the region and also the division among the Southeast Asian countries. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.